So, this week I'm doing a topic that Mike or Pie Master requested some time ago. He wanted to understand more about how to develop realistic and more rounded characters. And I've been coming across a lot of these kinds of questions on Twitter with NaNoWriMo kind of sneaking up on us. So, um, I spent realistic as in like these are people who could actually be people. I'm not saying they can't be a manticore or a dragon or a whatever, but who they are is logical. Like this is how people act. Even if if they aren't normal people, they're still people. So not 2D cardboard cutouts specifically. So there are three things that in my mind a character has to have, and it creates the framework of how you're going to it creates the framework of everything else you're going to use to create the character. So those three things are flaws, strengths, and desires. And desires is kind of a two-parter because along with that comes the how far are they willing to go to accomplish those desires. So we're going to kind of dig into each of these separately, but that's the snapshot preview. So one thing that a lot of writers struggle with, particularly in certain genres, I would say young adult and romance, and it almost always happens with protagonists, is flaws. People don't like to make their characters flawed a lot of the time, particularly their protagonist character, because they don't want the character to be weak or ineffective or unable to accomplish the thing, so they think that their character has to be perfect in every way. I point you towards Bella Swan. These characters oftentimes turn into wish fulfillment for the author, and they are. I haven't read the books, so I don't know if she's a sociopath. I can just tell you she's a badly written character. I have no other opinion on it. I don't like using the term Mary Sue because apparently that has some deeply sexist connotations because it's slung at all female characters and typically not at male characters, even though the male equivalent is Marty Stew. It's apparently become a thing. Um, a Mary Sue is a character that is perfect in every way. They are typically author inserts a lot of the time. They have very little depth. They typically don't have any flaws. And the term comes from a satirical Star Trek fandom short story that was written to mock this trend in fan fiction. I think in the early 90s, if I remember, or sorry, not early, late 90s, early thousands, if I remember properly, but it's been around for a while. Um, but yes, that is the correct. That is what I'd call them. I'm trying to avoid the term, so I'm going to say just two-dimensional character, um, because those characters are straight up wish fulfillment from the author. Um, these characters are frequent in, like I said, young adults novels. They are pretty frequent in romance because that isn't to say that romance doesn't have depth, but it's a genre where people like to be able to insert themselves into the main character, so a lot of the time the main character is not quite as rounded as some of the secondary characters. That's been a thing I've seen, and that isn't me picking on romance. It happens in all genres, depending on the author. Usually more experienced authors. There we go. I can talk. Authors do it less frequently. So that's a thing that happens. And one of the big problems with those circumstances is people don't give their characters flaws. So I know I love romance. I do. I spent a lot of time in the library reading Bodice Rippers in high school. It was my happy place. So I pick on it, but I love it. Um, so that's flaws for your character don't need to be things that are permanently at odds with any chance of success. They can be things like they're a little overconfident, so they'll make dumb decisions on occasion. A friend of mine on Facebook recently commented that characters can and should make stupid decisions, but those stupid decisions should be based in character traits we've seen from them before. So if you have a character who just refuses to face up to the big bad guy, maybe it's because they're too scared to. They could be a coward, which might be a character flaw for them, but that should have been shown earlier in the book rather than just at that moment. Or they could be just coming up against something so huge that they are having a very human reaction of, I don't know if I can deal this, and being overwhelmed. But that's kind of one of the things, is these flaws should be organic. Everybody has them. I am, in fact, I'm not putting up a video of myself because I look like a trash fire, speaking of flaws. I really need a haircut, and I look like death warmed over twice and left on the counter to go stale. So that's how I am today. um, so that's, oh, I am owning it. You guys just don't need to see it. Um, so that's why there's no video this week. I'm going to be getting a haircut soon and will look less like a terrible Muppet. Anyway, so the flaws should be things like, let's use Sherlock Holmes for example. In the original Holmes books, Sherlock was deeply addicted to opium and other drugs. If Sherlock Holmes misses a few key clues in a scene and the author has him just not pick up on something that he should have picked up on, well, maybe the reason for that is he's high. That is, in fact, a thing that happened with him. Or he hadn't slept in 5 days because he was on a bender, or any number of things. If Sherlock Holmes misses a clue because the plot needs him to miss a clue, he'd best have a reason, and that reason should be tied into his character flaws. So even if it's a dumb mistake, it should make sense. It should be kind of organic. And giving your character flaws will also give you things that you can use to show growth through the series. They can get rid of old flaws and develop new ones. Huzzah! Or even through a single book if you're not doing an entire series. A character might start the book with a deeply held prejudice of some kind, and at the end of the book realize that that prejudice was stupid and they no longer adhere to that way of thinking. Just as a quick example. Or they start as a coward and end up stronger. Organic flaws are things that make sense for a person to have, and they are shown through the course of the book and not just shown when they need to be in existence for the plot. So it's like it's like a version of Deus Ex Machina, except it's Deus Ex Machina in a bad way. It's like, oh yeah, I need my character to make a terrible mistake. Well, here's a flaw that I haven't suggested that they might have the rest of the book and never developed, but here we go. This makes sense now. I have not seen the show you're referring to, so I can't help you, but maybe? Right, Anagram. There are absolutely flaws that don't make sense in the moment, or a character that does something flawed that they shouldn't have. And those are inorganic and they're forced and they're put in there because plot reasons, and the author didn't know how to make the character do what they needed them to do for the story, and so they just stuck in a gaffe that they shouldn't have made. That happens a fair amount, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with the plot demanding that gaffe in that moment. Definitely use that tool, but you're going to want to set up the fact that they have this issue before. It's kind of like a Chekhov's gun sort of situation. There you go. I like it, Mel. And Heather, you're correct. Flaws should matter. Being adorably clumsy, it's not a great flaw. I mean, it's certainly a character trait, but I wouldn't even consider that a flaw. A flaw is something like, in my blog that's going to be coming out, I reference Iron Man a fair amount because he starts the series as self-absorbed, self-indulgent. He doesn't really care about anybody but himself in a lot of ways, and he's so convinced that he has the answer to everything that he ignores what everyone else has to say. And that develops through the series. I mean, He also develops new flaws, like his severe PTSD that he battles all the way up through to Endgame. Um, so you have characters who develop and lose flaws over time, but those flaws should hamper them somehow. And those flaws, like Chekhov's gun, should be something that come up in the plot. If they have a flaw that never gets screen time, so to speak, what's the point of having it? It doesn't need to destroy or derail the plot, but if you're going to give them flaws, they need to be present and they need to matter. And they need to be something that has impact on the story, the characters, and the world around them. Even if it isn't something the main story deals with excessively, it should be a big part of who they are. So, secondly, then we're going to get into strengths. Your character should have those too. Um, Strengths are, again, something that needs to be pertinent to the story. If you give your character strengths that never show up, or aren't in any way relevant to the story, or will never be relevant to the story, because if you're doing a book series and you introduce in book one that the character's really good at origami, and their skill at origami comes into play in another book later on down the line, okay, fine, that's cool. But if you never use it for anything, what's the point? Characterization, by the way, counts as using it for something. So if you have a character who folds origami when they're stressed and it's just kind of what they do, and you use that as part of developing them as an individual, okay, cool. That makes sense. It's not a strength, but it is a thing they do. So at that point, it becomes less of a strength flaw level thing as just a character quirk, which is valid and your characters should have them. But it's kind of outside the scope of what I'm getting at. Strengths are, going back to the Iron Man example, Tony Stark is an absolutely brilliant mind. He knows more about science than most any of the other characters, with the exception of Banner. Oh my god, Bannon? Really? Wow. I need to go back and rewatch Johnny Quest. No, Banner. And he's absolutely thank you, Mel. He's an absolute genius at it. And he uses that strength in a lot of ways to develop and further the character interests, further the plot interests too, because without his understanding of science, a lot of the things that happened in the various MCU movies wouldn't have happened. Both good and bad. I am going to get a little bit into shortly how you can use these strengths against the character, and you should, but these strengths should be things that push the story forward somehow. Sherlock Holmes's brilliant deductive mind always pushes the story forward. It is the core of who that character is. It is his core strength, and it is the thing that typically will push the story forward in some way. And that is an extremely valuable thing. So any strength you give your character should really matter to them. And it should matter to the story. Now, I am going to make a note of something. When it comes to strengths, be aware that not everything real is believable, and not everything believable is real. A lot of you know that I have a very real physical disability and I have on multiple occasions dislocated something doing something innocuous. I dislocated a knee making the bed, and I dislocated a shoulder putting my violin in a stand. Contrasting that, I am a highly trained martial artist, and I teach and participate in European fencing tournaments, and recently got a rather significant award for one. So those two things, you wouldn't think that somebody who dislocates their knee making the bed some days is capable of winning fencing tournaments, but here I am. In a book, readers would probably be like, no, that can't be a thing. And yet here we are in the real world with that actually being one of my strengths and actually being one of my weaknesses. So make sure that when you're doing your strength and weakness analysis, that things make sense and are believable for the character. You shouldn't just throw random strengths at the wall because, ooh, this character needs to have this particular strength in order to accomplish the plot I have for them, and I'm not going to justify it in any way, but here's the thing they have. It's an important thing to recognize that sometimes what is real is not always believable, and accept the reality as much as it's frustrating. So continuing forward, these strengths can also be used against the character. You can use these strengths to subvert expectations. Again, going back to the Marvel MCU, Tony Stark directly is responsible for Ultron's development. He caused Ultron. If you don't get that reference, he created an artificial intelligence that went rogue and tried to wipe out all life on the planet. And this was out of his flaw of wanting to protect the planet because he didn't think he could, and he didn't think humans with their various flaws and mistakes were capable of doing such a thing, so he wanted to create a perfect system. And in that quest to create a perfect system, he almost destroyed the world. His strength is his science, and his intelligence and his knowledge. However, that strength, that it blinded him to the fact that there are other ways and there are other possibilities. So that's a really important thing to think about. Your character's strengths can be any number of things, and those strengths can be used to lead characters straight down the wrong path. Sherlock Holmes, when he's dealing with Moriarty likes to yank Sherlock Holmes's chain and use that brilliant deductive mind of his to lead him down the paths Moriarty's controlling, to show him things that Moriarty wants him to see and give him information that Moriarty wants him to have. And Sherlock, because of the way his mind works, is just right there lapping it up. And he doesn't even stop to think that, oh, I'm being used half the time. So you've got these strengths that can be turned on their head and used against the character, and they should be at certain times. It's a valuable way to drive the story forward and can deepen and expose certain other flaws. So your flaws and your strengths aren't necessarily loggerheads to one another. They aren't polar opposites. But they are definitely things that can work in concert with one another or be used together to create interesting moments and scenes. So there's that. Does anybody have any questions so far? I see Raichu is typing. We'll get into the question about flaws and believability after the next section, which is desires, and then we can start delving into that, because this next section isn't extremely long. So when it comes to the final piece, the final part of the three-legged stool that is character development, we have desires. Many of you have probably heard Kurt Vonnegut's famous sentence, every character should want something, even if it's only a glass of water. That is how he developed his, right, what is my motivation? Perfect. That is how he developed all of his characters. Every character has something they want. And that should be true for every single interaction in your story. All these characters should have something they want. Now, it might be the barista at Starbucks in your story just wants to go home, and they don't want to be here today. And that could demonstrate any number of ways. Maybe they give bad service, maybe they're mouthy, maybe whatever. So it takes them from being just a cardboard caricature and gives them a little bit of life. And even if they're just a passing NPC, if they're worth mentioning specifically, sorry, my cat just lost his little mind and went charging through the room like a psychopath. Anyway, So even if the character is just going to be there for a short time, they have at least a little bit of motivation. Um, these desires, yeah, Kat definitely wants something, but nobody knows what. These desires should be mutable. They may change. They don't need to be one giant desire for the entire story. There might be multiple desires, and in fact, there should be desires because your characters should all have goals. They should have things they're after, things they want. The thing they want may not be the plot. The thing they want may not be helpful. The thing they want might actually be antagonistic, but they all have things they want. So these desires kind of tie into how they're going to go about getting certain things, because if they're going through the story and their desire isn't in fact to deal a death blow to the big bad guy, it's support their friend who's going to deal the death blow to the big bad guy. They don't really care about the bad guy so much, but they care about their friend. That's going to change the angle that they come at the situation from, versus if they wanted to go after the big bad guy and kill them themselves. There you go, perfect. Um, and that does, in fact, bring us to our next thing here is, what is the character willing to do to achieve those desires? Would you stab somebody in the eye for a Klondike bar? Some days, I think I might. Most days, probably not. But that kind of ties into, and it's also really useful for the villain or antagonist in the story, if you don't have a quote-unquote villain. It's great to help understand where the dividing line between hero and villain or protagonist and antagonist lies. It might just be how far they're willing to go to achieve their own ends. So, diving back into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I'm sorry to anybody who has not seen the movies yet, um, or doesn't have any interest in the movies, because these analogies are probably going over your head, so sorry about that, but I've been watching them recently, so it's where my brain is. It's either that or Avatar The Last Airbender references. Um, so the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you have this big bad guy, like the ultimate bad guy in the entire series is this guy named Thanos. And you don't need to know much about the series to know that Thanos, he wants to preserve life in the universe by killing half of the things that are alive in order to preserve resources, because resources are finite. The reason for this, of course, is that his planet ran into this and then everybody died, because no one was willing to do what is, in his mind, the right thing to do, which would have been kill half of them so half the species survives. And he does it in his mind, the most egalitarian manner possible. It's just 50% of all life in the entire universe is wiped out. He doesn't decide himself how. He just uses a particular power and says, "Okay, half the life in the universe I want it gone," and and half the life in the universe dies. Conversely, you have the Avengers, who want to protect everybody, who want to help everybody in the universe. They're trying to do the right thing, but they aren't willing to take that step of, I'm going to extinguish half of the life in the universe in order to accomplish my goal. They aren't willing to do that. So how far your character's willing to go has a big impact on whether or not they're a quote-unquote good guy or a quote-unquote bad guy. So you've got, because if you step back from it, both the Avengers and Thanos largely want the same thing, and Thanos doesn't see himself as evil. He doesn't see himself as doing things to hurt people. He sees himself as the savior of the universe, and very much doesn't want to. He doesn't want to do this. He sees this as a huge burden. He. It's not something that is going to make him happy or feel good, but he's trying to do the thing that he down in his bones believes is right. And that's what makes him such a powerful and potent bad guy. Continuing with the references, you've got the movie Constantine, or the comic Constantine. Gabriel is, by their estimation, doing the right thing in the movie by I believe they wanted to exterminate humanity, I think, because humanity was a catastrophe. They were trying to do the right thing. They believed they were a perfect servant of God and were doing what God wanted them to do. And they were willing to go to any ends to accomplish this desire, this goal. Whereas Constantine, he wasn't quite willing to go that far, but he's a very different character, very different desires, and frankly, in the end of it, he just didn't want to, die, and he didn't want everybody he cared about to die, so he was like, maybe we don't. Um, right, so yeah, Constantine is biased because he's human. He has that flaw. Um, but that is an example of desires and how they can shape a character. So these desires are one of the big things that will shape how your character acts and behaves and reacts with the plot. And knowing how far they're willing to go with these desires is one of the big driving points. Like, if you've got a character who would probably stab somebody for a bottle of water, that tells you a whole lot about their personality and their moral fiber. And I'm not talking about, like, in a world where there is no water, this is the last bottle of water in existence. I'm talking like it's Tuesday and they want a bottle of water. Right, or a Kit Kat or what have you. But there absolutely should be a reason that they do things. And this is, in some ways, more important for your antagonists than your protagonists, because they need to have a reason for what they're doing. They shouldn't just be like, I'm evil because I'm evil, and that's why. Screw you. They need to be evil for a reason. Right, so animal abuse gets the old stabby stab. There you go. There are a whole lot of different places um, in literature where you've got bad guys or people serving the antagonist who are, they think the antagonist is doing the right thing, but when they start seeing what the antagonist is doing, the ends they're willing to go, all right, into the Avatar references we go. If you haven't seen Avatar Legend of Korra yet, in season 4 there is a main character who gets swept up into this very charismatic individual's desire to quote unquote fix the world, and this character's desire to fix the world is willing to go very, very far off the rails to try and do what they believe is right. And the main character who gets wrapped up in that eventually is like, you're taking this too far. I'm not going to do this. I won't stand behind it. That's about as close to explaining it I can get without spoilers. So, but if you've seen all of Legend of Korra, then you'll know what I'm talking about. Yeah, it's really worth watching seasons 3 and 4 as much as seasons 1 and 2 were a little rough. Seasons 3 and 4 really kind of pick up that particular series out of the dust. There are reasons for that, but I'm not going to get into it. It ultimately has to do with production and publishing, not the writers. So that's about what I have right now for developing deeper characters. So to go back over it, you want to have flaws, strengths, and desires, and a knowledge of how far they're willing to go to accomplish those desires. And the flaws and strengths are things that need to matter. They can't just be random throwaway things. I'm so clumsy, but everybody loves me because I'm cute is not a flaw. I'm too smart for my own good, and it means that boys don't like me is not a flaw. It's I'm smart and tend to drive people away from me because I'm too analytical and think I know better than them. That's a flaw. But you can't frame the flaws in positive lights and have them still be flaws. You can have characters overcome them, but they can't just be like tee-hee type things. It doesn't really work. It makes the characters flat, and that's how you end up with sad two-dimensional characters. So, Raichu, you had some questions. There you go, Ellie. That's a really good example. So Ellie's example there is a combination shot of the character is cute and can use that to their advantage to get what they want, but since nobody takes them seriously, it makes it difficult for them to accomplish their ends. So, it's also worth noting that different genres have different character development expectations. If you're writing erotica, generally speaking, people are not as expecting of extremely deep character development. They are in it for the usually the sexual aspects and the romance aspects. They aren't as demanding of deep character creation and development, which isn't to say you shouldn't have those things. Um, young adult romance also doesn't really require a lot of deep character development. Cozy mysteries, if you're writing a Nancy Drew style story, your characters are probably going to be uh, far less deep and rounded because cozy mystery stories like Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys, they don't do a lot of development in those. Those are episodic, and the entire point is the plot, not the characters. So if you're doing something that is mostly plot driven, then your characters don't necessarily need to be as deep. If you're doing something that's very character driven, you need to have really strong characters. But even if you're doing something that is plot driven, your characters should still have desires and flaws and strengths. You just may not have to put as much work into them. So I'm just kind of rambling while I wait for Raichu to finish his questions there. Oh, while he is writing, those of you who follow my blog, you will notice the last 2 weeks have nothing to do with what we're talking about today. In fact, the last 2 weeks were a really deep dive into how to use the 3-act structure and the beat sheet to structure a series, using Avatar The Last Airbender as an example. So if you guys really want to dig into that a little bit, it would be too much for me to try and talk about here, I think, the way I did it in the blog, because I went through season 1 and put all of season 1 on the beat sheet. And then I took the entire series, put that on the beat sheet, and compared and contrasted the two, while also acknowledging that each individual episode fits in the beat sheet too. So it's complicated, but you guys might find it interesting. Okay, so okay. Okay, so if we're talking, hello, if we're talking about My Little Pony's Friendship is Magic, first off, I don't think there's a single bad guy in that entire series that has much depth. So we'll start there. Um, and you are correct, Anagram. Discord is a far more charismatic character, and with that charisma, I mean, he was voiced by the guy who played Q from Star Trek. So okay, well, yeah, she did. Um, the but Discord had the value of being voiced by Q from Star Trek, which yep, by John Delancey, who is a really wonderful actor, and the character was given more interest, I think. And early on, if the character is just going to be something as narrowly present as King Sombra and originally Discord were supposed to be, then they aren't going to do a lot of depth work on it. But this is also an episodic children's show, so It's a slightly different metric that you would want to compare them to. I think that would be the yeah, I would agree that King Sombra didn't get much screen time. We had no idea what his motivations were. We had no idea what what his plan was after he accomplished his ends. He was given virtually no screen time, and his motivations were never explored. Discord, his entire motivation is because he is literally the embodiment of discord. He is the spirit of chaos. That is his entire thing. His entire shtick is I am chaos. That is it. He's like Pie Master. Um, which I say with love, but Pie Master is Discord in human form. Um, the the difference, yes, King Sombra had some really fantastic character design. I really liked him. Discord had a somewhat more weird character design. He certainly wasn't as scary as King Sombra was meant to be, but again, he was kind of supposed to be wacky, and since it was a kids show, wacky caught on, and terrifying did not. Um, Ozai was not just evil for evil. Um, Ozai was trying to continue a war his father started because he was raised by the man who started that war to be a fanatic, which you see in uh, season 3 towards the end of it when he declares himself the Phoenix King. He's not stable. Azula's not stable. They come very strongly from the Azulon line. I could probably nerd out about this for a very long time, so I'm not going to. I'm not really going to bore the rest of you who don't know the series with that. That would be mean. Joker is popular. Again, he's a comic book character and a comic book villain. I think over the years in the comics he was given more depth, if I'm correct. Again, I don't read comics much, so this is not an area of expertise for me. But much like children's shows, comics specifically have a kind of a unique metric. So you've got kind of a difference there. So different, and that kind of goes back to my talking about depths of character in various different genres. Different genres have different requirements, and for some genres, a character who just looks interesting and looks neat is enough to inspire people to be particularly interested in it. Um, so the physical design of the character might be enough to get people's attention. And of course, if you're talking TV shows and stuff, having a really superb voice actor does a lot. Even if the character's two-dimensional, a really good voice actor can do a lot to it. Um, that's cool, Ellie. I don't know, like I said, I don't know that much about comics specifically. I've only read a couple of them. So that is an area I admit a lack of knowledge in as far as genre-specific stuff. But like I said earlier, certain genres have different requirements for depth of character. And let's be honest, as much as I like My Little Pony, you don't need the depth of character for happy, colorful, moving pictures time, which is the target audience of My Little Pony was like 4 to 8 to 10-year-olds. So they aren't looking for extreme character depth. While that developed a little over time because they realized an adult audience was interested in the show too, you could compare My Little Pony up against something like the new adaptation of She-Ra. The new adaptation of She-Ra was a far more meta-plot, story-driven story, and you had the antagonist. That's not Skeletor. That's He-Man. I forget his name. You had the thank you, Hordak. Thank you. Yeah, Hordak, on the contrary, was actually quite a rounded character, and you explore a lot more of his reasons and mentality through the show than you ever get with any of the antagonists in My Little Pony. It was also designed for the preteen audience versus the younger child audience. So you're not going to get as much character development out of a bad guy in a children's book. I'm talking picture book as you would in middle grade fiction. So those are that's certainly a thing to consider. You can't hold every single character up to the same metric because genres definitely have an impact on various different kinds of character depth. If you're talking middle grade fiction, one of the reasons why the Twilight series was so incredibly successful is because you had people who wanted to put themselves into Bella Swan's shoes. They wanted to be her. And she was wish fulfillment for a lot of those people. So she didn't need to have a lot of depth because people were just kind of ascribing their own experiences to that because everybody's been to high school. Or, oh, I won't say that. Not everybody's been to high school, but most people have dealt with teenage kids and dealt with similar experiences to the you can't sit here, you're not one of the cool kids moments, whether it's at work, whether it's at school, whether it's in any other number of applications and locations. But she was kind of deeply relatable to the target market, and that's one of the reasons why it blew up, because the love triangle and the will she won't she and ooh vampires, it's it appealed to that demographic and to many other demographics outside. It's kind of like how My Little Pony got a ravenous adult following. Which, no judgment, I'm not going to judge anybody for the media they enjoy. I enjoyed My Little Pony immensely, and I still like to watch it. Um, Maybe that specific trope is United States, but it definitely happened to me in school. Like, I went through that. I was shunned from all of the social groups in my high school because I was the weird kid. Very specifically, everybody who I went to high school with, everybody I went to high school with remembers that I was not socially conforming in any way. My school was full of Abercrombie and Fitch kids and who shopped at the Gap, and I went dancing through the hallways wearing my mother's old hippie clothing, flower crowns, and no shoes. So regardless of whether it's the cool kids table or not, the I don't fit into the social pecking order around here because I'm not like any of you is a universal experience.
I know when I was in high school, there were vampires everywhere.
Um, a lot of the people who criticize individuals for that kind of brings us back to the what's believable is not always real and what's real is not always believable. In stories, people want to acknowledge less of their own humanity and want to expect superhuman capacity out of people. And if you make a mistake, uh, if you make a mistake that's realistic and no, this person just choked under pressure. It's a thing that people actually do in the real world. It may be, it may well be a reflection of their own insecurity, but it's a pretty common thing that people aren't going to believe that someone just chokes under pressure, even though literally anybody can do that. Anybody can choke under pressure. But when you're writing a story, you have to sometimes write something that's more believable, even if what's real is what's real. You're going to get criticism no matter what you do, so ultimately you have to do the best you can. people are going to be, I don't like it for this reason. I mean, I'm all right. I'm getting ready to draw some fire here. I like the new Star Wars movies. I see flaws in them, but I enjoy them. And there are a lot of people who complain about certain aspects of the new Star Wars movies that I think are being pedantic and not acknowledging the realities of what's going on. So I will draw that fire. Um, you're going to run into circumstances like that with anything. Oh, this character wouldn't have made that mistake because blah blah blah. Or no, they should have made a mistake because blah blah blah. People are going to complain no matter what you do. So that is exactly the case, Mel. You have to actually filter what's useful and what's logical through the lens of, does this make sense? Is this going to be helpful? Or is it just somebody whinging because it's not how they would have written it? Because I'm willing to bet you money about 87% of the people whining about various different fandoms are mad because it's not how they would have written it. And, well, if it's not how they would have written it, they can go write a book. So that's an important thing to note. Um, but you do have to kind of err on the side of being slightly superhuman in your stories because your characters are probably going to be you're probably going to be a TLOU2. Was that intended for this chat? Because I'm not sure what you're. I don't recognize the game. Um, but yeah, you're getting. Oh, okay. I have not played The Last of Us 1 or The Last of Us 2, so I have not gotten into that controversy. But there are, of course, games where uh, there's of course a great deal of controversy over any number of things, and that's okay. You don't have to like Star Wars like I do. I completely accept that everybody has their own tastes and feelings about things. That's why I said I was going to drop fire. Be aware that my assessment of Star Wars is purely an opinion based thing. I'm not. Um, there are plenty of stories and games and such that I have really enjoyed that everybody else that I know of is like, oh my gosh, it's a trash fire, and how could you like this and still call yourself somebody who does anything with story? So I'm okay with it. Um, that all boils down to taste, and a lot of that comes back to a lot of people get mad because that's not how they would have written a story. Um, and yes, you are absolutely correct that you have to kind of take a what serves the story, what works for the character avenue towards dealing with things like, should they fumble in this moment? And if it works for the story and makes sense, then great. But you shouldn't have any kind of cookie cutter, really narrow thing. But you absolutely do need to consider what serves the story and what works for the characters through the lens of, what is the reader going to believe? Because I tell you what, if I made myself the protagonist of a story, nobody would freaking believe it. Because I have a genetic disorder that makes me literally fall apart putting things down sometimes at random without particular rhyme or reason, and yet I am a highly experienced martial artist and could probably break somebody pretty bad if I was of a mind to. Nobody would take me as a fighting character, even if it is real, even if it is logical. They wouldn't accept it. They wouldn't buy it. So you do have to kind of go with what is logical. And you are absolutely correct, Anagram. That critique usually comes from people who don't know that much about writing, to be honest with you. The people who are experts at writing won't usually suggest that you do it in their style. I might tell somebody, hey, you need to rewrite this section because it here are the various reasons, and I will tell you maybe even how to do it, but that suggestion of rewriting something comes from, I understand how the structure of a story is supposed to be. This scene maybe it might not be how I would have written it, but that's okay. However, if you're say doing a gunfight scene and you have a revolver and somebody's trying to chamber the effing thing, which is an actual thing that I have had to edit out of books, and I've dealt with a lot of gunfight scenes that were absolute catastrophes that I had to basically rewrite the entire thing because the author didn't know anything about firearms. That wasn't so much rewriting it because I think it should have been written my way. It's this has a lot of wrong data, or these characters, you never even mentioned them moving from point A to point B. Did they teleport? So when you're getting that kind of feedback from somebody, you need to consider the source. Is it coming from a professional? Is it coming from an experienced writer? Is it coming from just a rando? If it's coming from, El Rando, who's never written anything and probably hasn't read anything since high school English, you can probably ignore what they're saying. I like that, Mel. Yes, reality is, in fact, oftentimes unrealistic. That's something I'm actually running into in the map building community because there are plenty of cities and such in the real world that don't look like they would ever be believable as a map. So that's a thing. And Raichu, because people don't like disabled people and don't like to believe that disabled people are capable of accomplishing pretty badass stuff. So, you know, that's a reality. Yeah, Boston's pretty believable. Yes, Ellie, Jim, he's actually a serious badass. I love that man. Um, there's also Daredevil doesn't count because he's not actually disabled. He can quote unquote see, so his blindness is just a mild inconvenience. Um, so yeah, there's also another character who's going to be introduced at some point. Ellie, his name is Bart. He is also in a wheelchair for different reasons. He's pretty cool too. Toph Beifong, again, her disability only comes into play on rare occasions. Right, she's not actually blind, she can see. Which isn't to say she's not a cool character and isn't valuable representation and is not great. I love Toph. She's one of my favorite characters in Avatar. I love her. So don't mistake my uh, the trope of the blind character who can actually see as not being actually that disabled versus enjoying a character. But yes, there's a large number of people who don't believe that disabled folks are capable of doing anything more than sitting around drooling on ourselves. Um, yes, Raichu, a character can be simple and still good. So let's go with mm, I don't know. There are I don't have an example in my head right now, but simple doesn't necessarily mean bad. A character can be deep but not particularly complex. So um, I've got a character in the series I'm working on whose name is Tremor T. He is not a complicated guy. He is very straightforward. He loves his family. He works hard at his business. He is a combat vet. He's got some anger issues, but he's a fantastic dude. He's not very complicated. The fact that he's not complicated is a good thing. Um, but he's still got depth. He has an entire life. He has things he wants. He has flaws. He has anger issues. He has strengths. He's extremely loyal. He's very faithful. He's very kind, and he has things he wants. He wants to protect his family. He wants to protect his friends. Those are all. I mean, those are the three things are there. The flaws, strengths, and desires. They're there. Um, but he's not very complicated, and that's okay. So complexity is a mixed bag. And nice anagram. Wow. Yeah, Charles Xavier is a good. Xavier is a very good example of a character who is disabled. Though I don't know that his disability ever comes up very often. Like they don't show him trying to get up a flight of stairs. Um, yeah, he has a hover chair, but I don't know how high it can hover, so it might not go upstairs. I don't know. Um, the, uh, but there are characters in fiction who are disabled and whose disabilities okay, so Dragon Prince. You have the general whose name I forget, but you have that deaf general. Uh, Her disability is in fact a part of the story, and she can't. Yes, Amaya, thank you. She can't just communicate with anybody. The people she communicates with have to be able to understand sign language, and beyond that, they she has people who translate for her. She runs into times where she's frustrated because she can't communicate what she needs to the people around her. So there's an example of a disability that's not just wiped away with like, oh, by the way, I can see with my feet. Um, Again, not to knock Toph because I love her, but it is an example of a character whose disability is a part of the story rather than just being a side note. We are running over for time, so I think I'm going to call it here. As is as we can see by the discussion here, there's a lot of uh, I think so anagram. I'd have to go back and watch it. Um, the uh, the fact that there's so many questions, there's so much thought. Character creation is a really good example of a topic that we could probably do a couple of weeks on. I might do a discussion on how to develop antagonists soon. So that's a possibility. Since that's a question I hear a lot is how do I make my antagonist realistic? Excuse me. So that's a thing. We can talk about what you guys want to discuss next week soon. But I'm gonna call it here because I need to go eat food and then run D&D. Murder all the players. Woohoo! Yes, murder all the players for fun and excitement. Yeah, the line for good and bad antagonists, we'll get to that. I think next week maybe we'll talk about how to do antagonists. Um, but I don't want to get too far into that this week. All right, I hope you have a great night, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's nice to see everybody again. I'm going to go eat Chinese food. It's going to be fabulous. And then murder the players. Good night, everybody.